whoever you are, to all those who expect an expert exegesis, and to those who accept apocryphal anecdotes, hello. Today I want to tell you about a good book. Stephen Fry's Mythos is a humorous recitation of the ancient Greek myths. Like with other good books, the pages are packed with lessons to be learned and morals to be gleaned, but the author knows that his audience don't believe a word of it. There's not a lick of literal truth to convince people of, which is why it's so much fun. With no personal pride invested in the gods of ancient Greece, it's easy for us to accept that people created these characters in their own image. Hera, Zeus, Hermes, Poseidon, Apollo, and Aphrodite, in Stephen's words, are warlike but creative, wise but ferocious, loving but jealous, tender but brutal, compassionate but vengeful. In short, very human indeed. There's no existential mystery to investigate when reading these myths, no paradoxes to explain or contradictions to resolve. Because the stories were conjured from the minds of eternally fallible and conflicted human beings, they don't need to be inerrant in every detail. By contrast, if it was claimed that these myths were historically accurate, or that they contained divine instructions regarding our ultimate fate as a species, then we'd be compelled to scrutinize them religiously. All of us, by now, should be painfully aware that humans can make mistakes. So why then, when a real God, say the God of Christianity, wants to tell us something important about creation, or how to behave, or ways to treat each other and what to do with our lives, why would he recruit human scribes to pen the message? If you were the all-powerful creator of the universe and wished to communicate your plan, how salvation can be achieved, and instigate a meaningful personal relationship with every person on Earth, surely there are better, less contentious ways to do it than inspiring a book. If Santa Claus has the power to visit each of us personally on an annual basis, so could God. He could gently urge us to mend our ways every Christmas Eve as a trinity of Dickensian ghosts might. But no, instead, his decision to inspire over 40 different people, speaking 3 different languages at least, to compile a book in fragments over 1,600 years, invites criticism. So, inspired by Stephen Fry, that's what this podcast is going to be about. As the God of the Bible has already entrusted his holy scripture to generations of sinful, imperfect people, I'm sure he won't begrudge me sharing my 2 cents. Listening to conversations between Christians and skeptics on Justin Brierley's fantastic radio show Unbelievable, I heard about another old myth that absolutely nobody believes in the year 2024. A couple of millennia ago, in a remote and insignificant corner of the Roman Empire, a woman, perfectly poor and ordinary, was informed by a supernatural being that she was to give birth. The fact that this woman was a virgin hardly mattered, as her child would be divine. Miraculous conception achieved, her son would grow up to stand out in a few other remarkable ways. As a young man, he managed to form a new ministry, preaching the merits of spiritual rather than material living. Gathering disciples, he forged something of a messianic reputation, convincing many that he was in fact the Son of God. Various miracles lent support to this claim. He healed the sick, exorcised demons, and even resurrected the dead. It was largely due to such conspicuous breaches of the peace that he was eventually arrested and punished by the Romans. But far from learning his lesson, the scallywag supposedly returned to Earth after being put to death for his crimes, confirming to his followers that a heavenly realm awaited them. Books were later written about this person's life and his teachings. Now, if you've not heard of the philosopher Apollonius before, I wouldn't blame you. That's right, Apollonius of Tyana. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing either of those. It's not that this man's story is unbelievable. I mean, people tend to believe all kinds of crazy things. Rather, history has probably forgotten Apollonius because he had some very strong competition. Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus of Nazareth moved in very similar circles. If I had to pick a favourite, I'd probably go with A of T, mainly because he was a strict vegetarian who opposed animal sacrifice, probably the most widely dismissed moral imperative in history. He also believed that God couldn't be swayed by prayers or offerings, as I've suggested myself in episode 7. In fact, Apollonius thought that God had no wish to be worshipped by people at all, and that the Almighty could only be reached via our greatest gift, intellect. Amassing their respective crowds at around the same time, disagreements must have broken out over who was the true Son of God. But this was nothing special. As we'll see, the claims made by Apo and JC crop up all over the ancient world. The Romans were up to their aquiline noses in miracle workers and sons of gods. So I'll recycle my question from earlier. If you were the all-powerful creator of the universe and wanted to recruit believers, would you deliver people the gift they were expecting, muscling your way through a crowded market of forgeries, trying to win your children's love with a product they see advertised everywhere? Or would you risk something more original? This is an important question put flippantly, because virgin birth, miracle healing, ascension and resurrection may have been convincing back then, but that dubious list on any Messiah's resume crucifies their credibility today. As God, you would know that biblical unoriginality would present difficulties for later generations, when good evidence might save more souls than good stories. For reasons known only to himself, God decided that familiarity would be worth the sacrifice. Now we, antiquity's more numerous and enlightened descendants, must decide whether the Bible's repurposing of popular myths is enough to disprove its supposed celestial dictation. The Romans certainly hoped so. Roman authorities used the newcomer hype of Apollonius as a weapon against early Christianity by fueling the skepticism of Jesus' followers. The miraculous claims of both vying messiahs were so similar that offering a direct comparison would be like taking divinity from a baby, they figured. The Romans underestimated the tenacity of religious faith, but the thinking still holds true today. If the Bible doesn't reflect actual events, Jesus' teachings, or the inspired word of God, then Christianity is moot. As the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all of our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. Before I read Mythos and started listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio, and became interested in what other religious historians had to say about the life and times of Jesus, I would never have guessed how little of the Bible was new, different, or unprecedented, even in the time of Jesus himself. Take, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a collection of 5 Sumerian poems written between 2100 and 1200 BC. This most ancient of texts comes complete with a dead ringer for the Old Testament flood myth. In it, a hero is divinely instructed to build an ark and stock it with a globally representative animal cargo. The biblical flood story in Genesis matches that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, point by point and in the same order. The Mesopotamian epic also contains parallels with the Garden of Eden, with the characters Enkidu and Shamat closely mirroring Adam and Eve, whose names I have much less problem pronouncing. In both stories, a man is created by God from the soil. In both stories, a man accepts food from a woman, covers his nakedness, and is booted out of their former home in nature, unable to return. There's even a shady, serpentine antagonist. I remember when I first heard about the similarities between the Old Testament and the Epic of Gilgamesh, even as an unbelieving heathen, I felt cheated. But then I found more. If Apollonius has taught us anything, it's that virgin birth narratives were a guaranteed hit in our cultural past. A quick Google reveals that the Aztec Earth Mother Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec Earth Mother, a mythical Athenian king, the Chinese god of agriculture, and Egyptian god Horus, to name just a few, were all rumoured to be born of virgin mothers long before Jesus. And it's not just gods and deities. Prominent figures from history like Alexander the Great and philosophers Plato and Socrates, even Rome's twin founders Romulus and Remus, were reported to be immaculately conceived. Granted, the internet has a fickle on-off relationship with facticity, do check your sources. Even so, the full list of history's miracle births makes Mary's labours feel like an overplayed Christmas special. Parthenogenesis, or asexual reproduction, doesn't just occur in mythology, it occurs in nature as well. Creatures as diverse as birds, bees, and bacteria have been found to procreate without needing a mate. What's vanishingly unusual, even among sexless species, is resurrection. Bodily or otherwise, redemption through rebirth is an idea with no obvious biological roots. Yet the concept litters world religions like hay in a manger. Take Osiris, Egyptian god of life, death, and fertility. Worshipped around 2500 BC, this guy passed judgment on the deceased for worldly wrongdoings. Favourable people were born again into a new spiritual kingdom, assuming they'd followed all the sacred rituals correctly in life. Sound familiar? Not that anything I've mentioned so far is a knockdown argument against Christianity. That would be committing the genetic fallacy, as we saw in episode 17. It could be that all these vague similarities could just be coincidental. We couldn't charge the biblical account with plagiarism based on figures like Apollonius and Osiris without also looking to mythos and hitting up our man Dionysus. The only Greek god to have a mortal human parent, Dionysus was the god of wine, revelry, and delirious intoxication. Fathered by the king of heaven himself, Zeus, transforming blood into wine, returning from the dead, and ultimately making a name for himself as the liberator of all mankind, what better role model could a humble carpenter's son hope for 3,000 years later? If you're willing to overlook the glaring survivorship bias, the Bible's success does seem almost miraculous. Biblical historian Richard Carrier points out that anyone educated enough to write the Gospels will have been all too familiar with these pre-existing religious stories. They'd have known that most come with a son or daughter of God promising happiness or salvation after death, that these saviours undergo a passion of sorts, some personal struggle or strife that must be overcome, and for victory over death to be achieved before any good tidings can be shared with believers. It's mythicism by numbers. Which brings us back to the question of why God chose to reveal himself through such a predictable prophetic recipe. Here's a respectfully brief recap of God's strategy as I see it. Having spoken the universe into existence, God, the real God, waited patiently as mankind made all kinds of naive religious blunders. He listened to our false creation stories. He heard the myths and legends that we invented and watched on as we sacrificed innumerable people and animals in devout worship of non-existent false deities. After several millennia, enough was enough. When God finally stepped in, the actions that he took mirrored to an uncanny degree those same fictitious myths that humanity had been peddling for centuries. It was as if we crafted the form of our own salvation. God actually allowed us to inspire him. This flipping of the tables is kind of beautiful. It's poetic and sort of makes sense, but it's not at all what Christians believe. The problem is, suggesting that God was conducting market research during his prolonged silence, observing what kinds of tales humans develop a taste for, denies his omniscience. So, how about this? Granting that God sees everything in advance, maybe he allowed false legends to propagate, or actively inspired them all himself. This way, the life, miracles, death, and teachings of Jesus would be easier for us to digest later on. God would know exactly how much familiarity was necessary to convince those uneducated, illiterate masses of the truth. But then again, the original dilemma remains. By leaning so heavily on stories and ideas that pre-existed, the credibility of God's divinely orchestrated story of redemption was destined to degrade over time. The fact that billions would reflect on these historic events with enlightened skeptical rationality and dub the entire saga an elaborate work of fiction must have occurred to him. He was the one who graced us with rational minds after all. Any disbelief today was a foreseeable cost from the beginning. If you find scriptural accounts compelling, great. If not, that was a calculated risk on God's part. And it's a risk that affects all of us today. You see, what any individual calls reality affects everyone else around them. Nobody's beliefs exist in a vacuum. The things that you accept as fact influence every other idea or notion you're likely to hold. As every person arrives at the truth by a similar logical process, any mistakes lurking somewhere in the system can have multiple downstream effects. Holding a false belief can trigger a cascade of future beliefs that are also false, any number of which might go on to affect me. So, as long as we're all stuck here on this planet, I'd like my fellow Earthlings to keep the tightest possible grip on reality, for my sake and yours. For me, this will entail a lifelong commitment to instigating conversations and listening to discussions that challenge my personal beliefs, for the sake of humanity. For Christians, this involves taking 1 Peter 3:15 seriously, which says, quote, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." End quote. I've been building a kind of list here of my religious hang-ups. Scriptural unoriginality joins the paradoxes of God's character and the ugly sisters of inheritable sin and forgiveness through sacrifice. Another insurmountable roadblock on my personal road to faith is what's called divine command theory, which we'll be unpacking next.